Hello, everybody. One of the critical aspects of a comic book character is his or her origin and the story that goes along with that. A lot of times it's told at the beginning of that character's arc. It's an introduction. It's a good way to kind of show, how that person got his superpowers. It might be he's a mutant. It might be some sort of accident. Might have gotten bitten by some sort of radioactive bug, or he might just be somebody from a different planet. And it's a very critical part of the character in some stories, and in other stories it's just a non-factor. But one of the things that has become sort of a trope in the last couple of years or decades is this idea of kind of creating this mystery behind the character's origin and then going back and resolving that mystery. And this can work very well. And you'll see this when within certain stories it'll drop little hints, little clues, so that the reader or the audience kind of thinks to themselves, I don't know exactly what's going on, but I can guess. And then you have all these conspiracy theories that come out, and then people try to facilitate some sort of origin story. It's actually a really good way to build a fan base because people start exchanging their ideas and their thoughts. They have a community that kind of builds up around this. For years and years, people were always wondering about what was the origin story of Wolverine, for example. And they did a really good job when it came to the Weapon X origin story. And it was in Marvel Comics Presents. It's a story written by Barry Windsor Smith. Excellent story. One of the best stories Marvel ever put out, in my opinion, because it kind of delves into this what you kind of think is a normal person that they've turned into this weapon. And I mean, you do find out that his regeneration powers were naturally his, but it's interesting that that's how his kind of claws and his metal skeleton gets put together. So it's really, really cool story. It's sort of been adjusted. There's also another Weapon X series with Adam Kubert as the artist, but that original Weapon X miniseries, maybe because it was part of Marvel Comics Present, was tremendous at the time, because when you first read that, and this was years ago, it kind of truly delved into this person who was basically a mystery. Who was this Wolverine who was part of the X-Men, because he didn't know his origin himself. So that was pretty unique, because it's kind of like the soap operas where like guy wakes up from a coma, doesn't know who he is or where he's from or what he's done. And that trope carried on for quite a while, and it was really effective. Really enjoy the Weapon X origin. Things kind of went awry when they started to go back further with the whole James Howlett origin story. I think that was not good. And in fact, anybody who I know who was a Wolverine fan before that origin story came out hates that origin story. Me included. There are people who've maybe become fans of the X-Men after that, but they may like it, but it's because they didn't experience the, years of anticipation to see what was going on. Because what happened is, it's not a bad story, but it's a disappointment. Because, there's always kind of these hints being dropped to figure out who's this mysterious furred man with blue hair who likes to kill people, right? And so that was, I think it was one of the biggest misses Marvel could have done with a character. Because at the time, I don't know if people realize how big Wolverine was. Like in the late 80s and early 90s, he was the premier character. I would say he was more popular than the Hulk, more popular than Daredevil, more popular than the Punisher, and more popular than Spider-Man. He was the face of Marvel at that point. And so they took advantage of that, and they were like, okay, let's create this origin story. And it sucked. And there's a couple of things that happen when you do something like that. When you go back and you try and create these origin stories, one of the things that happens is you have a tendency, for example, to link the people and the circumstances and the events of the current storyline as part of their origin. So if, let's forget about Wolverine, but let's say you have, Super Bob. And Super Bob's got, at the time, he's got a girlfriend named Super Sheila, and he's got a enemy called Villain Bob. So Villain Bob and Super Bob, they're fighting it out. Then they do an origin story. Everybody finally figures out who is Super Bob and where did he come from. And then magically it turns out he's like the cousin of Villain Bob, or he's related to Villain Bob, and stuff like that. So it continues on. Again, it does work in some ways, but if it's not well written, it comes off as really corny, right? Because then it's basically saying, oh, so these people's stories have been entangled from the time that they were very, very small, right? The other thing to be careful about is when as you were retroactively introduce an origin story, you might end up in a Lost situation. So the show Lost introduced a lot of these like mysteries, a lot of these clues, and then people were kind of speculating what's going to happen with all these clues. And then what happened is a lot of those things just didn't get resolved. It didn't get resolved well. So, for example, if you go back to the Wolverine series, I remember like at one point, this always bothered me. There was a small wooden cube that like Jean Grey and Storm also held, but like it was given to Wolverine as part of like him to take care of, and they were fighting Ogun, and you were like, wow, this cube probably plays like this important role. And they kept saying like, this is the most critical, this is something that the fate of the universe is dependent on. And then like nothing happens with it. So you have an unresolved item that was built up to be this, fantastic thing, but then the writers forgot about it. And in fact, Larry Hama in an interview once, somebody actually asked him that. They're like, what was that cube? And he's like, I don't know. I was just making up stuff, and since I'm not writing anymore, it's just not being resolved. So you have to be careful when you're laying this mystery that you actually know what the origin story of that character is, because I feel sometimes creators can get off track. So they can start just doing these things with like, hey, I'm going to lay all these little clues out, but I don't actually know what's going on. I'll write the story later. I'll figure out what these clues mean at a different time. And that's why Lost was a phenomenal show at one point, and people were obsessed with that show, but it had a lackluster ending. So I think if you are going to do an origin story, either do it up front and tell people what the source of the powers are, the source of the story, whatever it might be, their backstory. Or at the very least, you don't have to tell it up front, but at the very least have it well articulated in your mind, so that at some point, if you do decide to tell the story as a standalone arc or as some sort of flashback, you actually have something fully developed. So if you are going to drop clues, you can do it. The other thing, just do flashbacks. Drop little flashbacks. You don't have to tell a complete story on their origin. Just give enough there that people can kind of piece the separate parts together, and you can kind of do it that way. Because sometimes it works out. If you do it really well, you can tell like a tale of a person's past. You can think of, I don't know, Gambit goes back to the swamplands of Louisiana, and he's got the Thieves Guild and the Assassins Guild and all that stuff, and you can wrap it up really nice. That's a good way of doing it if you can execute well. Otherwise, you can just drop little hints. So just a very random thought I had about this, but I just kind of wanted to put my thoughts out there and see what people think about origin stories and which ones have been done well, which ones have really been a disappointment. So let me know your thoughts, and thanks for listening. Bye.